Hi, I'm David Magnitsky, one of the pastors at Manchac United Methodist Church, and I want to welcome you to another Nourishment at Noon. I'm thinking about one verse in the Bible in the Gospel of Mark. It's in the first chapter, verse 39, and it says this: Jesus traveled throughout all the synagogues of Galilee preaching. Now, what I want to tell you is a few hundred years before that, it would have been almost unimaginable that this could have happened. The fact that Jesus would draw so much excitement, that there would even be a place occupied in terms of population movement in Galilee. It was empty for a long time. And the fact that there were synagogues were all a direct result of one major event. And that is the temple of Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Babylonians about 600 years before Jesus. And the people, many of them, were carted off into slavery. It was about that time that people began to pay attention to the prophets and start to look for a Messiah, someone who'd come and save them. And so this built a lot of energy when Jesus came 600 years later. Also, Galilee was by and large a barren territory until people started returning from exile in Babylon. They went to Galilee in what was sort of an ancient version of an Oklahoma land rush, and they went and occupied many unoccupied territories of Galilee. And when they got there, they had sort of a Scarlett O'Hara moment, if you remember at the intermission of Gone with the Wind, when she says, "With God as my witness, I'll never be hungry again." They came from Babylon to Galilee and said, "With God as our witness, we are not going to be conquered again." And they figured the reason they've been conquered was because they were not faithful to the word of God. So they devoted themselves to studying and obeying God's law. In fact, it was Galilee, not Jerusalem, that was the epicenter of biblical obedience. And then there wouldn't have been synagogues if they could have worshiped in the temple. So when the temple was destroyed, synagogues formed as a way of keeping the study of God and the worship of God alive. None of this would have been possible had the temple not been destroyed. So what I want to share with you is, out of a major disaster came new opportunity and new possibilities. And this continued on when the temple was rebuilt before Jesus came on the scene. But it was destroyed then about 40 years after the death of Jesus. A new possibility came from this disaster, and that is people realized they could no longer go to the temple and sacrifice animals anymore. So prayer and study became a form of sacrifice. And the synagogues invented in the exile to keep the worship of God alive became even more prominent. And synagogues spread everywhere throughout the world. And Judaism, as you know, because of the destruction of the temple and the Roman conquering of Israel, Jews were spread out all over the world. But there was still another disaster. In fact, many disasters would befall them. But one more in particular that you are aware of course, and that is the great event they call the Shoah, we call the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews died at the hands of the Nazis in the World War II era. And yet, out of the ashes of those bodies came one more possibility. In 1948, Israel came back together as a nation for the first time in almost 2,000 years. And few doubt that the impetus for this came as a result of the Holocaust. So it seems to me, when you look at the history of the Jews, and when you even look at things biblically speaking, the most important question in life is not why did something happen, but it really becomes, what shall we do now that this has happened? Or another way to say it is, often it is not the things that happen to us that are terrible or wonderful that are the defining events of our life. The defining events of our life become the response to things that happen. And so in all three of these cases, the first invention of the synagogue, the amplification of the synagogue, and the creation of the nation of Israel, they were all responses to terrible events. Jews waste little time asking why, and a lot more time, energy is spent on the question, what now? It reminds me of a story that you may be familiar with. My father-in-law, my late father-in-law, used to enjoy shopping at Home Depot. In fact, he'd take the dog with him, even though he wasn't supposed to, into Home Depot. And so I started thinking about Home Depot, and you may know the story that it was started by two gentlemen who had been fired by a major big box store of the time, Handy Dan. And they turned their firing and the disaster of losing their jobs into a new opportunity, and Home Depot was built. It reminds me of a poem, and I want to read you just a couple of lines from it by one of my favorite poets, David White. And he says this: "Sometimes with the bones of the black sticks left when the fire has gone out, sometimes with the bones of the black sticks left when the fire has gone out, someone has written something new in the ashes of your life." Someone has written something new in the ashes of your life. I wonder, what's being written now in times of disaster in your life? And could the someone who is writing be God? May God bless you until we're back together again. Remember, even though you have to stay at home, you can continue your journey.